IVM.
A moment comes, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new, when an age ends, and when the soul of a nation, long suppressed, finds utterance. It is fitting that at this solemn moment we take the pledge of dedication to the service of India and her people, and to the still larger cause of humanity.
Welcome to States of Anarchy, a podcast on global affairs and foreign policy. My name is Hamsini Hariharan. Every week on the show, I talk to experts and guests to make a little more sense of the world around us. If you're Indian, then you will already be familiar with Jawaharlal Nehru's speech that was played at the beginning of this episode. That was his speech on India's tryst with destiny on India's first Independence Day in 1947. Prime Minister Nehru, along with many of our freedom fighters, were idealists who believed in India's destiny to be an important player on the world stage. As we celebrated our own Independence Day last weekend, I thought about this tryst with destiny that India made, how becoming a great power was foreordained. Our civilizational identity, our size and potential, and this belief in Indian exceptionalism all led us and continues to lead us to believe that India is destined to be a great power. So, do we get to be a great power because we think we deserve to be one? How has this belief translated economically and politically? How has our self-image as a great power in the making affected our foreign policy? Our guest for today is special on many, many counts. Dr. Aparna Pandey is the director of the Initiative on the Future of India and South Asia at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. Her latest book, Making India Great, The Promise of a Reluctant Great Power, talks about India's belief in becoming a global power and all the challenges it faces. This is not the first time that Dr. Pandey and I are recording a podcast. About 3 years ago, when I was the co-host of the Pragati podcast, we had a great conversation about her earlier book, From Chanakya to Modi, The Evolution of India's Foreign Policy, which I'd highly recommend if you want a primer on the ideas that influence India's foreign policy. We'll get into the conversation with Dr. Pandey, but first, let's take a short break to hear from IVM Podcasts.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Been a really fun week on the network. Please do definitely check out all the regular shows that you do. But in addition, let me give you a few recommendations. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ritasha and Ayushi talk siblings. Really fun episode. I think you'll enjoy that. Nishad Pai Vaidya is on Cyrus, and they discuss cricket and a lot of different things around cricket. I think you'll enjoy that as well. Old friend Parmesh Shahani, he was on Absolutely Right. Definitely do check that out. Tamal Mills was on Edges and Sledges, another episode which I've heard really good things about. I haven't heard it yet. I need to listen to that soon. And guys, Uncle Please Sit. Definitely listen to that. They've been killing it. This week they have Abby Phillips. He's a doctor talking about medical misinformation. Last week, Paramita Vora was talking about sex education and who needs it. They've been really killing it. Definitely do check that out. And with that, let me get you back to your show.
Hi, Dr. Pandey. Welcome to States of Anarchy. I'm so glad that you're here. As I was just telling Sumit right before the podcast, that, the last time we'd recorded was back about 3 years ago when I was still in Bangalore working with the Pragati podcast, and we were talking about your last book. So I'm really happy that you're on the show and you're talking about your new book. So welcome.
Thank you, Hansini. It's a pleasure. I really loved and enjoyed the last time we recorded, and I've been looking forward to this. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Of course. So I think it's great that we're recording this podcast, so close to Independence Day. And I think it's because most Indians take pride in civilizational greatness, right? So why do you think civilizational identity has played such an important role in India's image of itself?
I think it's part of it is, cultural. Part of it is just part of it's the identity of being an Indian. You can be an Indian who's born in Chennai, in Bangalore, in Delhi. You could also have been born in Washington, D.C. or London or Johannesburg. But you grow up with being told and informed about India's 5,000-year-old civilization. The fact that it is only one of two such civilizations which has actually had a continuous history for 5,000 years. That it is one of two countries which has the largest population in the world, that sort of, India has achieved a lot. We have had multiple civilizations, cultures, we have monuments, we have architecture, we have languages. We are a democracy, despite the fact that we were under colonial rule, and unlike most other colonies, we did not turn to dictatorship. We managed to actually sort of, build an economy and become one of the top few fastest growing economies in the world. We have a military, but we are not trigger happy and we don't go around invading countries. And finally, we have a large youthful population. So we have all the ingredients, a lot of which is traced back to the fact that we are Indian. We have always been comfortable in our identity. And we've always believed, we've always wanted, and we've always expected that India will be among the great powers in the world. But at the root of it is this belief that we are unique, we are special. Why? Because we are Indian. And we are different. Why? Because we are Indian. The path we will take will be different from the path any other country took in this world. Why? Because it's the Indian path. It's something different about it, something unique about it, something special about it. It is something which our national movement taught us as well, that, we became an independent country without having to go through a violent revolution. It was a non-violent revolution or a non-violent struggle. Our image in the world is that of, a non-violent struggle led by Mahatma Gandhi. And so it's sort of, multiple reasons, but all of which come back to, the core of what is it to be an Indian? What is it to be a part of a 5,000-year-old civilization? It's reflected in our foreign policy, in our economy, and in our very identity.
I think that's really cool. You're right. We do have sort of a lot to be proud of in that sense. And, I was remembering when Abdul Kalam wrote his book, back in 1998, India 2020. And it was with a lot of optimism about where the country was going, and this was sort of the first decade of liberalism, and India's growth rates were shooting through the roof. But so much has changed over the last 20 years, I was just reading Pooja Mehra's new book, The Lost Decade, and it was talking about how the Indian economy has not regained its momentum since 2008. And, the euphoria of India's economic growth is dying down. And particularly if current rates of unemployment and inflation are going by.
Absolutely.
So what does all of this mean for India's rise in that sense?
So I think sort of at our core, there's a dichotomy, right? On the one hand, as Indians, we believe nothing will come in the way of India's rise. It's predestined. Why? Because, we will become a great power. On the other hand, we are reluctant, therefore, to look at what is it that stops us from becoming one. So, it's not as though the belief that India is great is new. It's not in the last decade. It's not in the last 2 decades. It goes back to our freedom movement. It goes back to the 1930s, 1920s, 1900s. People were talking about India becoming a power on the global stage. So why is it that 73 years after independence, we are still talking about a rising or an emerging or a not so rising? And at its core, I'll take up economy, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. I'm one of those who believes that, it's a combination not just of our not undertaking economic reforms, sort of, not implementing correct policies. Sort of, we may have done planning, but we haven't really actually sort of planned with a strategic intent that, let's say, 10 years from now or 20 years from now, like China did or the United States did, that, in 30 years, we will be the global economy. In 20 years, all supply chains will go through China. We have never planned our economy that way. And finally, at its core, the Indian civilization does have, I won't necessarily call it aversion, but there's a certain disdain for making money, for wealth. So if we look at the Western part of the world, how did the free market economy arise? You had Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment. You had the rise of a bourgeoisie, which basically, said they demanded law and order. They demanded, a state which would pull back and allow the market to perform. In India, there's always been this belief that the market does not know what is right for people. And yes, market may not always know what is right for people, but neither does the state. The state does not always know what is right. So a paternalistic state which wants to regulate every aspect of India's economy and economic growth, a paternalistic state which actually relishes being called pro-poor or socialist, rather than being called capitalist and free market and helping everybody become rich and wealthy, you don't allow the entrepreneurial spirit or the animal spirit of the economy and the market to grow. And so economic reforms are only undertaken when you have no other choice. So in 1990, 1991, they were undertaken minimally, the basic required. After that, it's about, let's say, 40 years now. And we keep talking about reforms, but reforms are minimal, sort of, part regulatory, part sort of, we talk about them, don't really implement them. We are reluctant to do something more, fear that, maybe the Indian electorate won't reward us. My argument, tell the Indian electorate that if you want to become richer and do wealthier and do better in 10 years from now, please accept the pain you're going to go through. If it could accept demonetization, it can surely accept pain, which will, in a few years, help everybody become richer and wealthier and the economy do better. That is the only way that India is going to grow at 8 or 10%. And unless we grow at 8 to 10% for a decade or more, it is impossible for us to achieve all that we want to achieve on the foreign policy, military, human capital, and just developmental issues.
It's very interesting that you say that. When I was reading through Making India Great, one of the things that I came across was, you were talking about some sort of reforms that we needed desperately to implement, whether it was in education, in cities, in healthcare. Do you think these are cases of like chronic underfunding, or do you think this is just sort of ineffective policy making because of this political lacuna that we have?
I believe it is sort of, it's a combination, but more the latter. I mean, many developing countries are unable to sort of, provide healthcare, education. And so I think, a lot of it has to do with just basic misgovernance, basic, inability to actually allocate enough funds and to plan. But I mean, I don't believe it is sort of, in this case, it is cultural or civilizational because, I give the example. I mean, how could the Indus Valley civilization have managed to build cities and managed to actually have granaries and, sort of build roads which could be cleaned properly, have a proper covered drainage system. And centuries later, India cannot do that for its own people. So I think it's more to do with misgovernance, more to do with, sustained policies. And thirdly, there's this belief that so that the public will never punish you if you don't really provide, basic food, water, electricity. Similarly, sort of, on the educational front, the emphasis has always been more on tertiary education, university, which is good. India has sort of, a number of sort of good universities. It has sort of scientific, engineering, medical establishments. I mean, those have problems and challenges as well. But no country has managed to become a great power or even a medium power without basic primary level education. And no country has managed to become a manufacturing hub without a skilled workforce. The average in industrialized countries is 60% of their workforce is skilled. India's number stands at 5 to 7%.
Wow.
So it's a massive. And the second part of it is, I mean, the two of us are talking. So, I mean, let's look at half of Indian population, which is women.
Mm-hmm.
More women were in the labor force in the 1990s than they are in India today. The global average is around 39%. for female workforce participation. China is higher, around 43. India's numbers have steadily come down, and I think we are around in the 20s somewhere.
Yeah, this is something that I'd spoken with my old colleague Devika Kher as well, because I think India is one of the few countries where you have a lot more women in education who are studying the STEM, for example, but those numbers don't translate into the workforce, and they choose, because of societal norms, to go back to home and stay at home.
Yeah. I mean, there are societal norms. I would also say that in the last decade or two, it's also become tougher as a woman to be working outside. I mean, it's a lot more dangerous for you to be outside on the streets in many cities. Unless you can drive and drive back, or your company is going to arrange a special van just for women to be picked up and dropped back home, sort of your family does not want you to go out alone. Because Indian society has become more unsafe over the last decade or two. I mean, it was safer, and here I'm going to date myself. It was safer for me when I was going to college in the 1990s than it would be for many people today. So I think it's a combination of societal norms internally and society externally that sort of, that has resulted in fewer women in the workforce, even though there are more women, as you rightly pointed out, in universities, in technical institutions, engineers, doctors.
Yeah, I completely agree. And all of that also makes me wonder, what kind of great power does not have half of its women working? That's something that I think we're going to just constantly have to work with. And it's not only about sort of feminism and bringing about equality, but it's about the fact that half of your population is not productive, or their labor is unpaid.
Yes.
And that's one of the reasons your economy is not developing.
Absolutely. No country becomes a great power with half of its population not working. And there are a number of studies which have come out which say that India's GDP would go up by at least 2 or 3% if there were more women working in the workforce. And so sort of, again, I mean, sort of, this is an issue which is sort of part social, right? So it's not as though, I mean, Indian culture, civilization has valued women. I mean, we've had Indian prime ministers, president, I mean, in parliament, legislatures, you have them in every arena. And yet, why is it that women still face these issues? There's a part cultural issue to it as well. I mean, it dates back to, I would say, the 1900s and even the Indian national movement. And this is one of the three issues that I look at when I'm looking at the social and civilizational challenges India has. The issue of women, the issue of the caste system. I mean, India abolished untouchability in its constitution in 1949. And yet, you and I can still find stories on a weekly, if not a daily basis, about discrimination, about attacks against lower castes and Dalits across the country. That, and the third part is, what is it to be an Indian? I mean, I always thought we had resolved that issue. I always thought that the Indian identity is what is enshrined in our constitution. It is what India's founding fathers sort of debated, discussed, and put forth. And yet, we still have this back and forth about, what is India? Is it the idea of a broader civilizational tent where it doesn't matter what your sex is, what your religion is, what your caste is, what your ethnicity or language is, you are Indian? Or is it that, no, I mean, it is a Hindu majority country, and that for about 1,000 years before, alien influences have basically tried to wipe out that Hinduness. And so therefore we need to build a nation with one culture, one religion, one language. And that then comes out in what we see, whether it is views on minorities, the desire to protect the cow, whether or not you and I should even be speaking English, or whether we should speak, whether as children we should have spoken only our mother tongue. And sorry, I sort of just wanted to add one point here, which is that, I mean, I am one of those who grew up speaking English. I also grew up speaking Hindi. My parents are from Uttarakhand, so I understand Pahari. I understand a little bit of Bengali. And I also understand Sanskrit. But I have never seen English as a foreign language. I always saw English as one of the many Indian languages, which it is one of our 23 languages. I also believe that, leaving aside the fact that I like reading and speaking English, it has always given Indians a strategic advantage. Unlike many other countries, sort of citizens, when we go abroad, we can integrate more easily, at least in the Anglo part of the world, whether it's the United States or UK, even Europe and other parts of the world, Latin America, Africa, Australia. I believe, businesses, tourists, sort of like the fact that they can actually speak English when they come to India. And I think we will lose a strategic advantage in this world if we sort of try and sort of prevent Indians or try and say that English should not be taught. I mean, I'm not saying, don't teach, always teach people their mother tongue, but add English as a mother tongue. I mean, let people learn Kannada and Tamil and Malayalam and Gujarati, but also learn English because you need the strategic advantage in this world.
Yeah, Dr. Pandey, I 100% agree with you because, I grew up in Chennai and I speak about 7 languages, both Indian and outside. And it's never been a problem for me to sort of add another language. Most Indians, if
Yes.
not all Indians who I know, speak
Yeah.
at least 2 languages.
Yeah.
And so I don't think, learning another language is that much of a problem. But I agree that it's sort of a strategic necessity for us. That's what sets the Indian economy apart because, you come here, you have a workforce which already knows English. So it's not that difficult for anyone who wants to invest in the country. And I've seen this repeatedly in countries in East Asia, for example, where a lot of the students say, "Oh, wow, how is your English so good?" And I say, "No,
Yes.
I picked it up when I was in school." And they go, "Okay, we also learned English in school, but not
Yeah.
like this." And I
Yeah.
think that's something that helps you in sort of global competition, right?
Absolutely. More than that, I mean, I'll tell you a joke. I mean, it's funny in many levels. When I came for my PhD to the States, to Boston, I was actually teaching and studying at the same time. And I realized that, my English was better than that of the American students I was teaching. And I would ask them, I mean, I said, I'm coming from India. I mean, it's one of many languages. This is the only language you are learning. How can your English be worse than mine? How can your grammar be worse than mine? And they would joke, but we're not teaching the English grammar. So what do you mean? I am taught English grammar from childhood. But it's sort of, it's we are taught English and we speak and write English well. I mean, most Indians will pass the TOEFL exam, which people have to take very often, because for us, it is grammar which you do in elementary school. So it provides an advantage, and it's like sort of you don't just know English; you can actually, sort of, read books, poetry. You can actually sort of have conversations, and that's something which, as you rightly mentioned, is different from many other countries, especially in East Asia or even Southeast Asia.
Yeah, we have an access to knowledge like most other countries won't. So, the amount that a lot of countries in East Asia spend on just translating works, for example, has not been a barrier for a lot of Indians because they're qualified to read sort of technical and scientific texts.
Absolutely.
And that's something that really helps when it comes to sort of the global market.
Yeah,
I'm going to pivot slightly since we're talking about English and sort of what it means to be Indian. The current government under the BJP has seen a lot of support, but it's also seen a lot of censure for some of its policies in Kashmir with the
Yeah.
Citizenship Amendment Bill and recently the Bhumi Puja. And
Yeah.
one of the things that the BJP does is use this narrative of reclaiming greatness. And to my eyes, reclaiming greatness is not a narrative that's particular to India alone, right?
No.
With China, you have sort of the century of humiliation, where they talk about, in very similar terms, about sort of the rebirth of China. In America, you have this narrative of this land that always sort of espouse these values of freedom and the American dream, right? So how would you see, the current government and this narrative of reclaiming greatness and how it plays into it?
So I would say at one level, the desire to reclaim greatness, or the sense of Indian exceptionalism, as I call it, is not new. The foreign policy at one level of this government, in my view, has a lot more of continuity than change. there's a sort of the passion for foreign policy, the focus on foreign policy is both because there's the desire to ensure that India achieves and gains its place under the sun, which has been India's foreign policy for 73 years. I mean, the advantage this government had was that when they came into power, India was growing at around 7 8%. The rise of China had started to trouble people around the world. And as has happened periodically from the 1950s, then again the 1990s, and again now, a number of countries have been waiting for India to rise so that they will have a country which can be part of the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific Quad so as to be able to stand up to China. So India has an advantage in the sense that at almost no time in history have other powers wanted a peer competitor to rise so that it can actually help them confront another country. So they've all been pushing and sort of wanting India to rise. And by and large, Indian governments have rarely sort of openly, they may say it in speeches in India, but they rarely said it abroad that we want India to become great. So this government has sort of, taken forward what Indians normally think within, but didn't really say out loud, though they wanted it. Where it is facing pushback and criticism is because, at the end of the day, India's rise, India's recognition, and its acceptance of its status by other countries requires that other countries be comfortable with India's view of itself. And for decades, India's view has been that of a democracy, a plural society, a country which is ethnically, linguistically, religiously different, and yet has managed to remain democratic and plural and secular. It's also a status quo power which does not have any territorial or ideological ambitions, unlike China. It accepts the international liberal order and it is comfortable with Western countries and doesn't despite being a former colony, it doesn't have unlike China, it doesn't have the century of humiliation. The problem, or the challenge India faces in the last few years is this quest for an authenticity, which is, to get over what happened in the last 1,000 years of alien rule, or to go back to a Hindu past, which is pre-Muslim, pre-Western. You turning back the clock on a number of issues like the identity of India, the status of minorities, and an excessively inward looking focus at a time when the world wants you to look outside is going to create a problem and is not going to sit as well with the world. The world looks at India as a country whose soft power has created an image. So for the world, India is still the land of Gandhi and Nehru. It is still secular India. The rise of a more Hindutva or a more Hindu Rashtra India may sit well with a large part of the Indian population and may do very well in elections. It will create a problem with India's relations, not just with the world, but with the immediate neighborhood. South Asia, the Middle East and the Gulf, and even Southeast Asia. India is going to face challenges, and we've already started to face some of them, because if our idea of ourself changes, then the region and the world's idea of what India will be like once it has more military and economic power will also change.
I think you've brought us to sort of a very natural succession to this, which is how has this idea of civilizational greatness affected our foreign policy, and how is it affecting our foreign policy today? In your last book, From Chanakya to Modi, you wrote about sort of this thinking in Indian strategy. So I want to bring that up as well.
Sure. So, as I mentioned earlier, a large part of India's foreign policy has remained the same. But there are certain challenges India has always had in foreign policy, and I will look at three aspects. First, let's look at India's relations with its immediate neighborhood. As both you and I know, for every Indian government, South Asia is of primary concern, not only because sort of, India views its neighbors as part of the same civilizational heritage, but because we have always viewed South Asia as our first line of defense. It protects the territorial integrity. It ensures that if our neighbors are sort of, keep our interests in mind, then there's less chance that external powers, currently China, will be able to get a foothold in the region. I mean, as a country which sort of, which shares borders with all its neighbors, we have always had territorial disputes. And even if we leave Pakistan aside, because there you have to bring in the issue of partition, issue of Kashmir, and Pakistan's own military establishment's view of India, and use of jihad as a lever of foreign policy. If you look at the other neighbors, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bhutan, one of the legacies is the territorial dispute. The other legacy is, ethnic linguistic similarity. So the Madhesi issue with Nepal, the Bengali issue with Bangladesh, and the Tamil issue. Instead of doing sort of, better in the last 7 decades, our relations with most of these neighbors are just as bad today or even worse than they were about a decade ago. They may not be as bad with Bangladesh or Bhutan, and that sort of, that is positive for us. But our relations with Nepal and Sri Lanka are worse at a time when China is actually more deeply integrated in our neighborhood. So it's sort of, one should think about why is it that sort of, as a potential great power, we are not even able to ensure that, in the words of the current foreign minister, the neighborhood is rooting for us. Is it just because of the territorial dispute? Is it just because of the ethnic dispute? Or is it at the core that we have not been able to give enough resources, give enough military support, economic support, and sometimes sort of, ensure that what the other country needs is sort of, we take care of their needs and their interests, and understand that domestic politics in that country will also play out. So we need to be able to manage it in a better way. Otherwise, we will have a problem. If we don't have South Asia with us, how are we going to get Southeast and Middle East? Second part, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, the world has always been more comfortable with an India that is more comfortable with itself. The more sort of, there are signs of an India which is less comfortable with itself within, there will be problems India will face with its immediate neighborhood. And we can see it in Nepal, we can see it in Sri Lanka, we can even see it with respect to Bangladesh. We may refer to a number of the things that are happening internally as purely India's internal matters, whether it is the Citizenship Amendment Bill, or it is the issue of Kashmir, or it is the issue of how we view our minorities. But for our neighbors and for the countries in the region beyond Middle East, Southeast Asia, it is not purely an internal matter. It reflects for them what is in the image of India. And for our immediate neighbors, whether or not they should be worried about what China and Pakistan have always referred to as a hegemonic, aggressive India. And so we play into those fears, even if I am one of those who does not believe India is hegemonic or aggressive. But perceptions matter in international relations, especially at a time when every country is turning nationalist, jingoist, and populist. Third, at a time when we want to become a great power, at a time when the world would like us to play a bigger role in Southeast Asia, Middle East, South Asia, Central Asia, and even beyond in the Indo-Pacific, if we don't have the money, we don't have the muscle. If we don't have the strategic intent, and we don't have the grand strategy, and we don't plan, we will never be able to deliver on what we promise. So that covers whether we can counter BRI by building enough infrastructure or giving enough developmental aid. It plays into whether or not we will be able to sort of, send enough aircraft carriers or warships for freedom of navigation. It also plays into whether or not other countries will view us as as a potential partner. If we are growing at 2% or 3%, we will not be a great power. We will not even be a regional power. We have to grow at 6% just sort of to cover many of the issues. We have to grow at 8% or more if we want to achieve any of our foreign policy, military, and any other strategic desires. I hope I answered your question, Anjali.
Yeah, you did. And I think, a lot of it is also maybe because as Indians, we're confused as to how we see ourselves. On one hand, we want to be seen as sort of the regional power in South Asia, and as a partner to the US, and, someone who's going to come to the table at international and multilateral forums. But on the other hand, we're also a country that has very few resources to spend on foreign policy. Considering how much we need to commit on ourselves, it's difficult to commit to others. It's also that we see ourselves as this developing country that needs concessions on the international stage.
Yeah.
And so that sort of provides this dichotomy in how we view our greatness.
Absolutely. I mean, we can see it, let's look at the international organizations. If you look at WTO, India has been part of GATT and WTO. But for the last decade or more, we are viewed by many countries as a sort of, as an obstacle, right? Mainly because we want, at the core of what we demand at international fora often is an exception for India. That, because India is different, India is unique, India has a large population, a large part of it which is below the poverty line, and therefore we have certain needs. Understandable. But we always want an exception rather than become part of what is happening in the world. So WTO, we demand an exception. On the UN Security Council, we have always laid our claim for a seat. Again, because we are 5,000 years old, because we are 1.2 billion, because it must represent every continent. So we are part of the G4, that is Japan, Germany, Brazil, and India, which should be added, and a veto power should be added. You look at IMF or World Bank, we want to change the rules of these organizations so that the developing countries and countries whose economies are growing, who have larger population, should have a greater say. There's a part belief that the organizations set up in sort of post-World War II are more Western oriented, and I will admit they are. But asking an institution to change simply because it's Western oriented doesn't really make a difference. What you need to do is build your economy and build your military so that by default people understand that you are a power which needs to be reckoned with. Again, if we look at something like the India-US civil nuclear deal, it was an exception for India, right? We haven't signed NPT, we haven't signed CTBT, the US hasn't signed CTBT either, but we have demanded an exception for ourselves. So part of the problem is that instead of building the resources, instead of building the status and and therefore becoming a great power, we believe that our history, our civilization, our uniqueness, our population, our size, our democracy entitles us to a unique place. And while it has worked and may work for a little while, it's not a long-term strategy. And sooner or later, if we are not able to fulfill what our promise is and fulfill it soon, all that we will be left with is this uniqueness, which will not really be able to get jobs for our large population, provide healthcare, build our cities, or modernize our military.
Yeah, you remind me of something that, we look at in policy when we say a narrative without action, without backing is just rhetoric, right? So, for people who were born, like my students, for example, were born in the 2000s, and therefore they don't sort of know a pre-liberalized world. And therefore they're having a difficult time contending with an India that is behaving in a way that they haven't seen before. And I think it's that. If I look at multilateral forums like BRICS or G20,
Mhm.
all of these were formed at a time when India's potential was something that was counted on, right?
Yes.
It was saying,
Yes.
okay, India is not doing very well on a larger scale, but if you consider its growth, then it has
Yes.
potential to be at the
Yes.
table.
Yes. Yes.
And that was what people were counting on. So if
Yeah.
you sort of take away that potential, you take away the growth, you take away the investments that we've made, and nothing
Mhm.
that we've and so far a lot of what we've done in the past hasn't added up, then I guess you could say that our promise to be a great power isn't fulfilled.
No, I agree totally. I mean, the thing is, the promise has always been there, right? I mean, the promise is centuries old.
Hmm.
I mean, I can find, speeches given by Indians. I can find books, including a book which I quoted in my book,
Mhm.
by Will Durant, the famous American historian who wrote the 11-volume story of civilization. He wrote a book, The Case for India, in 1930. So people have talked about the potential of India, not just Indians, but foreigners. People have talked about the promise of India. But at the end of the day, the question is going to be, are you ever going to deliver on your promise? Are you working towards your potential? And if you are not, then sooner or later, you will hit that brick wall. I mean, if we look at, we've talked about economy, we talked a little bit about, let's look at the people. Every country's sort of potential are its people. We talked about education. We talk about you need to build not just education, but you need to invest in healthcare. You also need to invest in electricity and sanitation, water. Finally, how about cities? I mean, a large percentage of Indians live in cities, and more will live in cities. It is amazing that India was more urbanized than China in 1950s. India is less urbanized than China today. And so, sort of, I mean, again, if we look at something like the military, I mean, India has a very large military, numbers wise. But have we really invested in our military? I mean, our military at some level is still the same military which we inherited from the British, with some, additions, with some tweaks. But we haven't really changed how we look at the military first. We haven't really invested in the military equipment and modernization, which we have promised for the last, I would say, 2 decades, if not more. And if we look at standing committee reports of the parliament going back to the 1950s, demanding that we, modernize, demanding that we update. So we may have a large military, we don't have a great power military if we look at how much of the equipment is out of date and how little of it is state of the art. Second, Chinese military has moved into sort of, let's say technology, AI, sort of other. Has India sort of, really even has the Indian military modernized even in those arenas? And third, a lot of what the military does and what defense does is planning. Most ministries of defense or departments of defense have a section which plans 15, 20, 40 years out what the world will be like. And that is how you sort of you plan your training, you plan your modernization, and you plan your equipment purchase. I joke that the Indian Ministry of Defense is very often Ministry of Defense acquisitions and purchases or lack thereof. There's very little of the strategic intent and strategic planning that 20 years from now, 40 years from now, how many of our squadrons or how many of our aircraft carriers will no longer sort of be there, and we'll have to retire them. So can we make sure that in 20 years, 40 years, we can replace these? And just one example, the Indian defense budget. We had sort of, let's say, there was percentage wise, India was spending more on the military in the 1980s than it is spending today. It's 1.5 or 1.6% of GDP in the last budget. And the last few budgets, the percentage has gone down, and a large part of that goes for salaries and pensions, and very little actually goes into capital purchases. So how are we going to stand up to the competition with China? How are we going to even protect the neighborhood? How are we going to be the power in the Indian Ocean region if we don't have the military capability and the strategic intent required to be a regional, forget about being a global power, and achieve that potential and promise which everybody else and we ourselves see in India.
Dr. Pandey, I was just wondering,
Yeah.
we've been having these discussions about, the lack of unpreparedness, the lack of investment that we need to do for our military, how much, reform needs to be done with the foreign service and increasing its numbers.
Yeah.
We've been having a lot of these discussions for decades now,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
But
Yeah.
these things just haven't happened. And
No.
I'm wondering, how much of this do you put down to sort of a lack of a grand strategy of what we want India to be? We know that we want India
Mm.
to be a great power, but I'm not sure, that our Indian policymakers and thinkers know what that would entail.
Mm-hmm. So I would put myself in the bracket as somebody who thinks I don't think India has really developed grand strategy. There are many others who believe, we've always had it if we go back to Chanakya. And then, through the decades, I say, yes, Chanakya did, but Chanakya was centuries ago. I mean, part of it, I think, has to do with the fact that as a status quo country, which came, modern India, if we look at it, which came into independence in 1947, there was a belief by the majority of India's founding fathers, especially Nehru, Prime Minister Nehru, that India did not have any enemies. So, what K. Subramaniam, the famous strategist, once said: India lacked that paranoid sense of insecurity, which very often helps you, build a military industrial complex, or gets you focused on, really worrying about building your military and having a grand strategy. Because we didn't really fear or believe we have enemies or threats, most of our focus in the initial decades was on social and economic and, domestic issues. Aside from the wars with Pakistan, it was a war with China which really led India to say, okay, maybe we do, but we still didn't invest that much in military or grand strategy. And part of that has to do with the fact that, as a country which is protected by the Himalayas in the north and the sea on most other sides, there is this belief, again, I trace it back to the Indian exceptionalism, that, we've been there for 5,000 years, we will be there for another 5,000 years. Maybe a little few kilometers here or a few kilometers there may come and go, but in the end we will survive. That, let's just look at the example of China. I mean, yes, China has always been seen as a rival or a threat, especially from the late 1950s, but the presumption has been that it doesn't really benefit China to have a war with India. That sort of, we will be able to, at the end of the day, if we have a fight, we can actually stand up to China, and maybe we'll have a minor problem here and there. But right now, the world will also come on our side. So we don't plan or strategize or war game. I mean, all the reports which have come out tell us that China had planned this, and when they plan it, they plan everything down to, how many troops they need, what sort of, what backup supplies they need, what sort of, what all they will need to do. From India's point of view, when this happened, the defense minister actually had to fly to Russia to ensure the supply parts could be provided. So there is still this belief that we can survive whatever is thrown at us. Even, I mean, I'll throw the economic example in here. I mean, India is supposed to grow at maybe negative 5%, according to our International Monetary Fund, IMF reports. We were as it is growing at 2.5% before COVID hit. If we grow at negative 5 this year, the government will need to do a lot more on the reform front to ensure that we get back to, 2, 3, 4, 5% next year. It will not automatically jump back to 6% or 8% next year. But are we planning that? I don't know if we are. I don't yet see any signs that we are planning that. How are we going to jump from negative 5 to a positive 4 or 5% next year? With China sitting and refusing to back off from the line of actual control in various places. How are we going to convince China to walk back unless China believes that India is a peer rival and that India has the military potential? As you and I know, we still don't have the Mountain Strike Corps. As you and I know, there's a lot that the Indian military has asked, not just equipment, but even, sort of uniforms and shoes and all that required for spending the entire long winter up in Ladakh or in Arunachal or along or in Sikkim. Have we prepared for that? And if we have not prepared, then at the end of the day, is it just this belief that we will survive no matter what happens? And this is just a small pinprick or a temporary, setback that we have, and we will bounce back. And so I don't see grand strategy sort of, being reflected in India's foreign and security and defense policy. But then I have a bigger problem, which is that I don't believe that as of now, the Indian Ministry of Defense actually does strategic planning. And strategic planning needs to be done by the Indian Ministry of Defense, including both civilian and uniformed services and outside expertise. Just as the Indian Foreign Service needs not just more IFS officers, they may be good, but if you have 1/6 the Foreign Service officers that China does, or 1/3 that Brazil does, or around the same that Singapore does, then there's a fundamental problem in your becoming a great power and your being able to actually argue your case around the world. So you need more people. You also need more expertise, both in-house and outside. And especially in the military realm, you need more uniformed military speaking, talking, and planning along with their civilian counterparts. And finally, you need the money. Without the money, you will not be able to achieve any of these. And all that requires grand strategy. All that requires deciding where is it that India wants to go? What is it that India sees itself as, aside from the basic belief that we are great or we will become great or we have the potential to become great? I mean, how are we going to become great? What is the strategy we are going to take, or the multiple strategies we are going to take? What are we going to do in the next 5, 10, 15 years? And I don't know if we are doing all that.
So would you say all these big questions that we've been talking about so far, about how we see ourselves, our place in the world, would you say these questions that you've raised at the end, would they be what we should be looking to? Do you have any answers on what India can do to fulfill its potential? Is it that we should be planning more for the next 10, 15 years?
So what I would say is, I would like sort of, there are immediate and there are long-term reforms that we can do in all these arenas, right? So first, I do believe that, at the end of the day, sort of, if you want to become a great power, you need to sort of, have sort of settle on an idea of yourself. I mean, trying to right a wrong from 1,000 years ago is not going to help you become a great power. Being more comfortable in yourself, valuing your heterogeneity, valuing your diversity, and actually investing in your people is what is going to make you a great power. So avoiding social tensions and actually investing in people should be the strategy domestically. That includes more money and more investment in education, healthcare, and cities. And sort of, they are both short and long term sort of, strategies, sort of, policies. But that's first and fundamental, because without a literate, educated workforce, you're not going to be able to become sort of, one of the hubs for the supply chains or manufacturing and things like that. Second, would be on the economic front. India does need the second generation of reforms, not just, regulatory tweaks, but actual, land acquisition bill, labor market reforms, capital market reforms, agricultural sector reforms, and a more openness to trade. Self-sufficiency, every country wants to be self-sufficient, both on the economic and the military front. But in 73 years, self-sufficiency hasn't really made India an economic power. It is our liberalization in the 1990s that helped Indian economy grow. And so both in the both in the manufacturing and economic front, trade front, but even on the defense front. India needs, more trade with the world. It needs more investment from the world. It needs more technology. And for that, you need to open up more. Even if 20 years from now or 30 years from now, the goal should be that India should be a manufacturing hub and that India should be able to manufacture defense equipment, at least for now, focus more on trade and bringing in the investment that will ensure that in 30 to 40 years, you can achieve your goal. And finally, sort of, on the military front, the Indian military needs modernization on multiple levels. Sort of whether India likes it or not, India has a neighbor and a rival sitting along its northern border, which is also present in all its neighbors and in the Indian Ocean region. And the way to counter China is to make sure that China understands that India is an economic and a military power and a country which is planning to become a great power, which isn't just thinking about becoming a great power. So I think all of these policies need to be implemented. Will they be? I don't know. I often joke that, as an author or as a policy wonk, I write because I hope that someone somewhere is listening to what I am writing and someone somewhere in some government is actually thinking about it. Whether they actually follow through on all the recommendations I or somebody else has made, I don't know. But as an Indian, I do hope that at least some of these sort of, recommendations and policies read and thought about by the powers that be.
I hope so too, Dr. Pandey. I hope there is a listener out there who is thinking very deeply about these questions and answers. Here is my last question for you.
Sure.
What are books or resources that you would recommend for people who want to know more about India's great powerdom, about Indian strategic thinking?
So I would sort of recommend on different fronts. So for economic issues, Pooja's book, which has come out, Pooja Maharaj, is a good book. One of the other books I really like is by T.N. Nayanan. It came out a few years ago. Turn of the Tortoise or something like that is the title. Mm-hmm. It's a good book. It sort of, breaks up what are the problems, including this belief by Indians that, size alone will compensate. And so if you're interested in why India hasn't been able to achieve what it has on the economic front, Nayanan's book is really good. Looking at military, I would say there's a new book out by Anit Mukherjee, The Absent Dialogue, about why is it that the Indian military, there's been very little, not just modernization, but the connection between the civilian and the serviced military service officers. Why is there such little connection? What are the reasons for why India hasn't in the Indian military side or defense side is yet to modernize, integrate, strategize. I believe that's a good book on the military front. I think these are the other books I would recommend to people to read.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey. Thank you for coming on the show and for best of luck with this amazing book.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure, Hansini.
That's it for this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us all the way till the end. Dr. Pandey's recommendations are in the episode description as usual, so do go and check those out. If you have any comments or questions, you can reach out to me at Hamsini H on Twitter and at States of Anarchy on Instagram. And every Friday, we organize a mini quiz on our Instagram page, so come over and test your knowledge of the world. States of Anarchy is supported by the Takshashila Institution and the Independent Public Spirited Media Foundation, and we're very grateful to them for their support. We're also grateful to you, dear listener, for tuning in week after week. If you want to help us reach more people, leave us a rating on iTunes or any other podcast app so that more people can discover us. You can listen to States of Anarchy on the IVM podcast app or whatever you're using right now to listen to me. We'll be back on the 1st of September.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कोटस्ताने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में। जहां प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।
Filter coffee is a fascinating beverage. You need to pick the right beans, blend them in the right proportion, roast them to perfection, and slow brew at the right temperature to get the perfect cup. Which is exactly like great conversations as well. You need to track down the most interesting minds, get them into their zone, and settle down for an unhurried, unscripted chat. And coffee for me is always, always, always best enjoyed with friends. I'm Karthik Nagarajan, and do share my table as I meet some of the most interesting people I know and sit them down for a strong cup of coffee and an even stronger conversation. Join me every Wednesday for a freshly brewed episode. This is not frappe. This is the Filter Coffee Podcast.